All right. We are now recording after some technical difficulties. Apologies to all of those that weren't able to log back into this particular meeting. We had to start a new meeting because Scott's meeting wouldn't allow me to record. So Shane and I, an intrepid band of two, are going to present to you tonight's workshop. What I will do, as per usual, is I will share my screen. Okay, so what I wanted to look at with you this evening was just the steps in the risk management process. And this should all be revision for you because you would have looked at the steps in the risk management process as part of your project plan. I guess there were just a few comments that I wanted to make. I'll see what Shane thinks of all of this. But when you have a look at the text, and I'll zip over to the text now, the way that they go about analysing legal risk, where is it? How to analyse. There it is. The way that they go about explaining the legal risk assessment process is, I guess you should understand this, it's driven by predominantly, I believe, Matthew Whaley's experience in the legal risk area, and he works for one of the big four accountancy firms, and yet he specialises in legal risk assessments. So it's just my take on things, but I suspect that his accountancy background... Oh, we've got Robert. Hello, Robert. Oh, that's great. Hello. That's an achievement getting on here. I was just starting to say, to give you a little bit of background on the way that Whaley and Gazzellian go about structuring their legal risk assessment process, and the fact that it is driven, I think, by an accountancy viewpoint. And as such, it's really very driven by hard data, the quest for hard data, the quest for numbers to crunch and numbers to place in front of the C-suite, the board, to kind of shock them into doing something about whatever risks have been identified. So in the quest for arriving at what they say are, is a set of hard data on the legal risks that are identified, they forego the usual legal likelihood / consequence matrix, and they set up this scenario matrix model, which I'm not 100% sure that I really like. So here is the usual risk impact matrix that tends to be used by most risk assessors when they're going about doing their job. So you're looking at rating the impact or the consequences, it's usually called consequences, rating the consequences should that particular risk event occur and crystallise, and then looking at how likely it is for that particular risk to crystallize, okay? So you're saying, what are the chances this might happen, the likelihood, and if it did happen, how bad would it be, okay? And that gives you, well, in my humble opinion, a pretty good snapshot of the nature of the risk. And really what you've got to bear in mind in all of this number crunching and assessment process, what you are trying to do is arrive at enough information to be able to then prioritise which of the risks need control treatment first up, first cab off the rank, which are urgent that need to be contained, which are not so urgent, or they're, really quite inconsequential and they don't really need any controls at all. So I don't have any problem with the way that Whaley and Gazelian, say, okay, first off, you've got to do the risk identification. I do have a bit of a problem with the way that they go about this scenario analysis. So instead of the rather, I think, simple and easy to read, easy to digest likelihood/consequence matrix, and perhaps a better illustration of that is in the, where are we? Here, this is it. CQU, the lovely CQU risk management framework. And here is the consequence/likelihood matrix there. And I think that gives you, as you can see, particularly with the colour coding, you can see it makes your whole evaluation step much easier, because if you can plot in each particular risk into a category here, you're going to be able to see at a glance which are the risks that need immediate attention, which are not quite so urgent, and which you can safely ignore. Yes? So I think it's quite an elegant and very, very widely used model for plotting risk. The way that Whaley and Gazelian go about it, because what they say they don't like, and I'll just flip back to that, what they say they don't like about this particular likelihood consequence matrix is they say that it's too subjective. You've got a bit of a subjective evaluation on what the likelihood is of this thing crystallising. It's a bit of, crystal ball gazing. And there's also a bit of subjectivity that can creep into your assessment of consequences. So in their quest for harder data than that, they go hunting around for an alternative model, and they come up with this scenario. Where's it doing that? I'm not having a lot of look. There we go. This scenario matrix. And what they do here is they grab out two extremes. They say, what if this risk crystallised, what would the typical kinds of losses be? Put a hard number on it, okay? So we've lost that assessment about whether or not the risk might occur. There's no assessment about the likelihood of this thing crystallising. They proceed from the assumption that the risk will crystallise, okay? And then they say, okay, if it did crystallise, what is the typical kinds, I can't underline that thing. What are the typical kinds of, I'm trying, this thing is hunting me. There we go. What are the typical kinds of losses that you would sustain if the risk actually occurred? and they're saying, look first at the direct impact. Obviously, that's their hard data. So they want you to put a dollar figure on this thing. If this event crystallised in the ordinary situation, how much is it going to cost you in hard dollars? Okay, then they get to the softer aspect of it. They say, what would the impact be on your reputation? Okay, and in the quest for hard-looking data here, they ask you to rate the impact on the reputation on a scale from 1 to 4. Okay, so you get a number over here as well, and it looks very, very hard data driven. Then what they say is you add up the overall typical impact, and then you do an alternative scenario here. You say, okay, if this same loss was to crystallise, but it crystallised in a way that made the consequences much more extreme, what would your hard dollar losses be over here? What would the impact on your reputation be over here? Sum up those two, get an overall extreme impact there, and then you're moderating the two by coming up, as you can see down the bottom, with an overall impact. Okay, and you're going through this analysis for each of your potential risks. So what you end up with is down here, 3.6. There you go. No, it's not. Where is it? Sorry, I'm hunting around because this thing just doesn't want to. Okay, there we are. So you can see here, this is a risk that they've started to analyse in table 3.5. And you've got the estimates there for the typical kinds of losses, and then towards the right-hand side, the extreme kinds of losses. And they're getting you to put that hard dollar figure under each, and then they're getting you to reduce your estimate of impact on the firm's reputation to a figure. Okay? And then they're getting you to compare the typical and extreme versions, and down the bottom there, overall risk, you're erring on the side of caution, and you are erring on the side of the highest of the typical and the extreme ratings. So you're winding up with a numerical rating for each of your identified risks. Okay. I'm not necessarily convinced that that is quite as simple and elegant as something like the likelihood/consequence matrix. I don't know what you guys think. Did you have any views?
Typical accountants. Typical accountant's attitude.
I think there is, yes, I would have to agree insofar as
in the board.
They really do go on quite a quest for, data that looks very hard and fast and quantitative, when in actual fact, if you get down to it, really, you're making the same kinds of subjective assessments about each risk as you do in the other matrix, I think, anyway. They say that, you can quantify your estimates here with hard data if you do actually have, for example, litigation costs. litigation costs that have already been incurred against similar kinds of loss. You can verify your estimates that way. My answer to that is, well, what if you haven't incurred those costs before? It's going to be an estimate, much the same as any other estimate on the likelihood/consequence matrix. So, and I think that becomes a bit more apparent too when you're talking about estimating impacts on reputation. Again, I think it involves the exact same kinds of crystal ball gazing that you need to go through with the likelihood/consequence matrix. And the thing that they like about their method is that it reduces things to a numerical figure. I don't necessarily think that it makes it less subjective, is my point. So you are more than welcome to use this scenario analysis in your projects if you prefer that look of hard data. If not, I am very happy for you to use the likelihood/consequence matrix if you wish to do so, and it's useful for the purposes of your argument in your project, then go ahead and use that one.
I worked, before I graduated, I worked in mining, and these all risk analysis. Every day you're doing these kind of things for tasks because it's such a high risk environment. And when you're talking about being subjective, you might work with electricians, operators, boilermakers, fitters. Everyone come in to do a task, so everyone's got to sign on to it, everyone's got to go through the process. It'd take you near on a day sometimes because everyone's got their idea of what the risk is. Obviously, they all, as part of the collaborate stage as well, what we're talking about is everyone's got their own ideas of what the risk is, what's acceptable, what's what the value of the risk is, and all that kind of thing. So all of these things that we're looking at right now, I've seen them plenty of times. I don't really enjoy it.
It's causing mental scarring.
Yeah, I have flashbacks at the moment.
I know. In another life, I actually trained as a personal trainer, a gym personal trainer, and we had to do these risk assessments even there for the risks that cropped up for the gym.
Yeah, ours was always the focus was always about showing that you're reducing the risk. So some tasks which really the risk never changed, we kind of have to play with numbers a little bit to make it higher in the initial stage, so then we could kind of reduce it in the second stage, because that's just part of the rules. We couldn't have, some sites won't let you have the same risk after your control measures go in, and it was, sometimes it can be very painful.
Yes, yeah. And it wouldn't let you because of the way that the system was structured. So you had to play around and put in a higher risk assessment to start with, and then show that your control measure had achieved its purpose by putting in a lower rating afterwards. Yeah. These systems can be designed to cause great angst and wailing and gnashing of teeth.
Unfortunately, they're not necessarily authentic, are they?
Well,
when you've got to look at doing that sort of thing. So, you can understand it in safety areas where probably it's much better to have a higher probability, but in other areas that might be looking at regulation or production in different economic environments. The appetite for risk in the board that makes the decision certainly would not lean towards that sort of thing, because that would take it more to the extreme end than a pragmatic end.
Yes, yeah. And this is where, if you have a look at the CQU framework, which is really quite good, they actually talk about, where is it? Tolerable level of risk. They talk about tolerable level of risk to start with at the beginning principles. And then they also, and I bet you I can't find it now because it's such a long document, but they also talk about CQU's, risk appetite. Sometimes they call it a risk profile, and it's useful to have those kinds of things. Let me see if I can find it. Appetite. There we go. Risk appetite. More often it's called risk profile, but and it just sets out what the acceptable risk is for various different kinds of risk. And Robert, as you pointed out, there are some things where there's just no tolerance for risk, and that's very more than appropriate for things like health and safety. Okay, zero tolerance for risks in health and safety. Zero tolerance for risk in corporate governance and compliance. Yep. Interestingly, zero tolerance for compliance risk. So everyone at the university in every department is expected to both know and comply with the relevant regulations, the regulatory environment that they are housed in. And I think that's quite acceptable. And then they go on and they say, well, we've got a low appetite for these kinds of risks: learning and teaching, research, engagement, HR. And then low to moderate. So accepting a little bit more risk with things like IT, asset management. Yes, more of the, I was going to say non-core, although IT is a relatively core part of the university's business. So perhaps that would fall more towards the low end, and perhaps the moderate end might be perhaps something like asset management. Yes, so they've stated quite nicely up front what their risk profile is, or their risk appetite, and then that makes the actual assessment process itself meaningful, because you've already said, okay, these are the things that we will accept, these are the things we will not accept, and that then helps once you've actually identified your risks and you go ahead and you do your analysis here. Let's go to, so this is the Standards Australia HB 296, and here we've got the steps outlined for us very nicely in rather a rudimentary form. The thing that I really like about this one, and what Robert mentioned before, was it puts that whole establish the context element at exactly where it should be, at the top of the whole process. And I think, I don't know if you'll agree with me, but I think one of the things that kind of makes Whaley and Gazelian's model a little bit, well, perhaps open to some difficulty in the implementation phase, is that they don't expressly include that whole contextualisation step. And that, as Shane said before, you know, when he was completing his risk assessments, you are usually consulting widely with, you know, every other different kind of stakeholder in this. And if you don't expressly include that as a step and you just approach this as a purely, you know, conceptual exercise that can be done, for example, by in-house counsel, you risk then that being developed in a vacuum. And then when it comes to implementation, you've got the stakeholders saying, hang on a minute, this doesn't include these risks, or these risks have been inappropriately analysed, they've been inappropriately evaluated. You're not going to get the kind of buy-in that you would otherwise get, I think, if you start off with something like this. Yes? And if you think back to our little, I keep referring to it as our analytical toolbox, but I mean, if you think about deep thinking, systems thinking, even responsive regulation, all of those models start with the assumption that you down the track somewhere, you're going to need buy-in. In terms of deep thinking, you're going to need to implement your prototypes somehow and get some kind of meaningful feedback. You're not going to get that unless you've engaged the stakeholders early on. In terms of systems thinking, you need to analyse the context, both external, internal, so that you can work out what are the dynamics of this system, what are the subparts, how do they interact, how does that system interact with other systems. You're not going to get a complete picture. Well, in terms of systems, you're probably never going to get a complete picture, but you're not going to get a sufficient picture unless you've done your contextual work first. In terms of responsive regulation, again, context is king. You can't regulate a bunch of regulatees that have had no input into the whole process. The whole notion of implementation, buy-in, successful treatments and controls is going to be compromised, I think, if you don't have this first preliminary step. And if it seems like I'm labouring the point, I probably am, but I think, you know, the fact that we have the text now just leaping straight into the identification phase shows that perhaps out there in the accountancy world, context isn't quite given the predominance that, you know, we've placed on it in this course. So that's a couple of weaknesses I see in the text's treatment of the process. I think the identification phase, where are we? The identification phase shouldn't be causing people too much of an issue, because that's the legal problem that you've come up with in the first place for your project. The analysis we've discussed this evening, and we've just compared the Whaley-Gazelian approach, which is driven by, you know, as I said before, a bit of a quest to arrive at, you know, a hard number figure, as opposed to, you know, the softer likelihood consequence matrix that you see out and about in the marketplace. Evaluation, as I said, that step really is just about prioritising. You're looking at your matrices or whatever scenario analysis that you've done, and you are prioritising which of the risks really need urgent treatment right down to zero treatment. And then you're looking at developing your proposed controls and having some kind of monitoring and review process. Okay. What I wanted to do now really was to, I'll go back to the CQU one because I really quite like that. To kind of hand it back to you and have a look at the Zoom session questions that I've put in this week's notes. How are you, do you find, Robert, that you've got kind of a handle on the way that the process works and where you can kind of fit in your preferred model, like whether you're using responsive regulation or whether you're using de-thinking or whatever? Is this all shaping up for you?
I think what you've said in regard to the accountant attitude towards it is where it does fall down, because if you don't get people to buy in to a system, they won't respect it and they won't treat it with respect. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, in a lot of different areas in industry especially, they don't necessarily take a lot of input from the people that are at the coalface, so to speak, and that who have a totally different idea and attitude towards what the people that it might be the accountants are doing. And I think that's very relevant, that it's got to be placed in context and for all people to actually buy into it and say, yes, we've got to do that because that's reality.
I think, it just occurred to me that, when you are trying to drive your analysis with, data and nothing but hard data and lots of nice dollar figures and numerical assessments, you tend to lose the, if you will, and I'm going to go out on a limb here and call it something fuzzy and tree hugging, but you tend to lose the human face of all of this.
The empathy.
I think you do. And of course, if you're all about numbers, well, there's no problem with that. And their angle is, well, really what the board wants to see is, numbers, because they're factual and they don't lie and they're not subjective. When in actual fact, there is, as I said before, a fair amount of subjectivity, I think, kind of housed underneath those numbers. And if you're doing all of that, what is legal risk? Legal risk isn't just all about, numbers and figures. It's not about isolated issues that, have no bearing to the real world. A legal risk is necessarily housed in the messiness of the whole of that organisation's operations. And you're not going to get an idea about the organisation's operations if you're just looking at the figures. I couldn't tell, for example, Joanna's project. I couldn't tell anything about the Breeders' Council just by looking at their books. If I looked at their audited accounts, I could see their profits, their losses, but that's not going to tell me what that business does. Do you kind of get where I'm going with this? It doesn't give you the context, and that's really, I think, the crux of the matter.
Well, the reality is that you cannot eliminate risk completely.
No, you
so
can't.
You've got to assess it as best you can and then manage it as best you can.
Yeah.
And, that means that you need to have it in context, because otherwise you can't do that.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think there's any point beating about the bush. I think you just need to call a spade a spade. You're saying you're not saying that there is some magical formula that's going to lead to some guaranteed solution. And I think the whole numbers exercise is kind of along those lines. What you're saying is this is an analysis, and any analysis really, when you're looking at changeable risk, legal risk, risks that may never happen, risks that if they happen might be gruesome, might be inconsequential. It all involves messiness, a bit of subjectivity, and a bit of, you know, as I said before, crystal ball gazing, but you are doing that in an educated fashion with a, you know, a solid methodology, and you are doing it in a way that I think is probably more transparent. And in these days, you know, that's what you want as an organisation, is transparency. You don't necessarily want to be saying, here's all these beautiful figures, this is the way we need to be doing things, when in actual fact, you know, there are a whole lot of assumptions that underlie those figures that just haven't been expressed. So context. Now, what I wanted to touch base with people about in terms of context was, are you, and that flows on from, you know, what Robert said, context and going through the empathy stage. Is anyone having difficulty in working out how they are going to go through that empathy stage or establishing your context? Is there any research difficulties that are cropping up there? I haven't had a chance to read your project plans yet, but I'm aiming to by Friday or by the weekend. How are you going?
Yeah, I think once once we get the results back or feedback back for that assessment, I'll have a better understanding, because the context, I think, was about how to establish where everyone's at, like the business, the user, the employees, and that was kind of part of the research thing, was basically casting a really wide net there and saying, what is it that, particularly with the business, what do they actually want with the website? Mine was the website developed. Sorry, Robert, is it the website? What do they actually want from it? Is it meant to be like a primary tool of referrals or to get people in, or is it meant to supplement? And I think that kind of helps with the whole context for, you know, for the employees and for the clients, because, you know, the user, potential clients as they come in.
Yep.
And that's kind of what I put. I put a big, you know, for the research, like questions or whatever that I was looking at, and it was just a big, basically a form really wide net at first, and then kind of feed in from there. So I think, depending on the feedback, and that would depend on how well I've understood the context.
Yeah. I wouldn't imagine that there were too many difficulties in examining context for your particular project. You've got some fairly readily identifiable stakeholders. So, you know, the system is not too dense.
It's obviously the for me, it's a lot different kind of assessment than what we're used to in the law degree, the original undergrad program. So that's just more what I'm thinking about, is if I've got my head around the actual process. Like you said, the context is fairly, you know, what I thought was straightforward with who's involved and what they're looking for. But just because of the way it was, it's not a typical thing that you get used to, a problem question, an IRAC or something like that. So that's,
yes,
it's very, very different. So that's kind of what I'm
done, that real world stuff.
Yeah, that's it. So that's kind of what I'm waiting for. I think once I get the feedback from that, I'll have a better understanding, and, you know, hopefully you say you're on the right page and everything.
Yeah. That's good. Robert, how are you? You're not finding any particular research problems that are cropping up?
Not really. Mine is to do with bail
Yes,
of
that's
violent
right. Yeah.
offenders and that. And, I think first off you've got the aggrieved, and you've got the offender, you've got the police, you've got other parties that are a little bit further away. But what I have thought about is the domestic violence orders and the protection orders and that, especially the ones that are taken out by the police.
Yes.
I think that's where they've almost been forced into a position because they really haven't got anything else they can do. And I think it's counterproductive in that, I volunteer at the Community Legal Centre in Rocky quite a bit. And, we have a lot of these referrals come through. And, either of the parties don't really support them. It's the police have done and said, they've had an argument and the police were called and that. And because of that, they've then put a protection order out, and it's not necessarily something that's going to help the situation. And I think there's got to be something that's more along the lines that there's got to be consequences for people that take out protection orders in a vexatious manner, and that if they're just doing it to try to say assist something in a family law matter or something, and they do that, if it's shown to be vexatious, that there's got to be some sort of cost to it. I don't think the police ones really do anything. If anything, they can antagonise a situation. And that's so. I think a lot more thought needs to go into that. And I think you've just got to look at the reality and the human situation, and that, and look at how that can be best addressed. And you don't want to look at winners or losers or anything like that. You've got to look at the situation, how it can be addressed so that parties can actually go forward with it. The unfortunate thing is that you're going to have some situations that are not going to be able to be mitigated, and I don't think there's anything you can do for that. There will be some that there will be consequences from, but I think you can do other things that are going to assist in, making the aggrieved feel much safer and more comfortable, doing things that the police can be proactive instead of reactive. And I think also that the perpetrators have to accept some consequence for their actions so that they can maintain liberty, but it may mean that they've got to keep a device on their person all the time, so that if they're going to breach an order, that it will be known in real time, and then the police can actually do something proactive to address the matter.
Yeah. I'm sure that you set this out in your project plan, but have you you've got a research agenda there that will help you establish the context? Robert's kind of frozen on my screen. I think he's having internet issues.
Hasn't really been our night, has it?
Not really. We've managed to troop on through, though. I've kind of covered off most of what I wanted to cover off, despite all of the travails. Really, all we wanted to look at tonight was just the steps in the process, and we've managed to do that. I did want to touch base with people just to see if they felt as though there were going to be any research obstacles in their way in terms of, properly establishing the context and, getting information about how stakeholders felt about the issue. Shane, you're probably really glad at this point that you've chosen a law firm.
Yeah.
So you've got some, fairly captive participants.
The only thing I'm concerned about is I think I haven't got the sheet in front of me about when we're talking about prototypes for testing. Is that just a theory that we have for a testing thing? Because I'm not sure.
It depends on how much you want to bring in de-thinking to your analysis. I mean, I'm really leaving it up to you guys to, as I said before, to pick and mix with...
I've found these last few weeks, I've found de-thinking, that was pretty difficult for me. I found this is just, I guess because, like I said, I dealt with it so often, the step-by-steps and the matrices and everything like that, I'm quite familiar with, whereas, de-thinking, it was...
It's a bit out of left field, and that's probably necessarily so, because if you think about where that's coming from, it's coming from the design and manufacturing field, and they were really all about, shaking things up, getting people inspired, particularly in terms of creating new products. And so in the product arena, it probably makes more natural sense for that methodology to work. Margaret Hagan's website is useful in applying de-thinking to the legal arena. But I would agree with you, it probably has more natural synergies with the whole product development pipeline than it does legal analysis. And you kind of got to shut one eye and look askance, to try and get an idea of how it's going to help you with legal analysis. As I said, Margaret Hagan does a great job of it. But my suggestion to you would be, go with the methodologies that you resonate with. Don't necessarily try and jam that square peg into a round hole. If you're not really enamored with the whole de-thinking process, leave it and pick up the tools that you are more comfortable with and that you think, resonate with, the way you want to approach things and the design of your project. So I wouldn't worry about leaving out de-thinking. If you are happy enough to work with, you seem to resonate with responsive regulatory theory the other week. If that's your bag, run with it. Run confidently and I'll be impressed. So no one's going to be penalised for failing to implement any of the... it's not a case that you need to implement each. It's more of just an analytical toolkit that's designed to help you flesh out these things. So when you're talking about prototyping, you're really talking about, the development of your controls. And, in the ordinary sense, in most legal risk assessments, there really is no prototyping step. I mean, you could say it's a prototype until it's gone through, well, that's one way of putting it, isn't it? You could say it's a prototype until it's gone through this iterative process enough times to be considered, you know, the shiny object that satisfies everybody's needs and works in the way that it's intended and does everything it needs to do. So,
because I had the prototype would be the website updater, which would obviously be well and truly beyond my skill level to actually design a prototype that actually did that. Well, like I said, well beyond my abilities.
Yours and mine.
It took 3, 4 years, however many years, to get onto Word, and I still have to get my wife to tell me how to make the diagrams line up in a straight line, and so that's my skill level. So there's no chance I'm ever going to get this prototype.
No. If you can describe it for me conceptually, that's what we really need. But in terms of treatment, like I said, if you're not enamored with de-thinking, go straight for responsive regulatory theory, or systems thinking, whatever, you know, or a combination of the two. But it's not necessary that you're going to have prototypes. As I said, you may well think of your controls that you want to implement. And I guess with any control, at least for the first iteration, you know, you're going to be then, after whatever period it is, monitoring how it worked. Like you said, you know, in the usual process, it comes back around in 6 months, 12 months, and then you see, well, can we adjust this risk rating now? Can we adjust it down? Has it done what it needed to do? And that's where, you know, you're tweaking and you're refining, I guess, your prototype for the next iterative process. And then at the end of the next 6 months or 12 months, you know, you may well have wound up with something that's, you know, locked down and ready to go. Yeah. Okay. Well, it's 8:38. I don't know what time we started, but we've covered off everything that we need to cover off. And I reckon that could probably do us for this evening, unless you have any further queries or questions.
No, I'm very happy at the moment. Like I said, once the feedback comes back, then I'll probably have questions about the process for probably next week or the week after. But at the moment, like I said, this kind of makes a lot more sense because I guess, like I said, I've been exposed to it a fair bit. I like the steps as well. For me, it's a lot easier to conceptualise, 1, 2, 3, and then leave that. That makes it a lot easier for me. So I'm happy.
Great. Sweet. That's what we like. Happy peeps.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. No worries. Have a good week.
You too. Good night.
Bye.